Heidi ho, Cameron. This is going to be your notes that we're doing in class, and we've only got about halfway through these. We've been spending a lot of time on our timelines and our calendars, but if you can get these done, you're going to be pretty caught up with us, and that's good. As a matter of fact, yeah, I think you're going to come back next week. You might even be a little bit ahead. We'll see where we're at. But if you have a chance to print those notes at home, it's a really good idea. It's just super easy to take the notes on paper. If you can't print, keep the notes open in a separate tab, and every time we come to a new screen, fill out those notes and then pay attention to the video. Here we go. We're talking about different types of sources. Every historic account is made up of sources. When we watched our video on 9/11, that video was a source. It was how we learn about a historical event. Then we read a historychannel.com website that told us more about 9/11. That was another source. So when we're creating history, when we're making textbooks, when we're writing accounts of what happened, we need sources. Okay, and there's a couple different types of sources. And we're going to talk about the differences between them and the pitfalls and what's wrong with each one and what's great about each one. So take your notes. Here we go. I'm going to go relatively quickly, so feel free to pause when you need to, just because I only get 15 minutes to make this video and there's a lot of stuff coming up. So here we go. There are two main types of sources. This is how we find out about stuff in history. So when we study an event, we have to find sources. We start with primary sources from people who were there. And then if we want to get even more in depth, we go to secondary sources, talk more about that in a little bit. But primary sources are what we mostly work with in class. We try to find primary sources because they're the best actual description of what happened. Because who can describe better what happened than somebody who was there? And if they were there, they get to be counted as a primary source. And then secondary sources. Secondary sources are made from primary sources. So if I gather a whole bunch of eyewitnesses and I gather a bunch of diaries and pictures and everything else, I can put them all together and say, well, this is what really happened. And that's what the historychannel.com thing did with 9/11. It took a whole bunch of primary sources and said, like a year later, okay, here's what we know happened. Okay, so secondary sources are kind of combine all those primary sources. So some examples of primary sources. This is a journal. And you can tell because it's written in handwriting. Journals can be great primary sources, especially if somebody who was at a thing, Gettysburg, or you know, the signing of the treaty that ended World War I or whatever. If they were there and they write like what it was like, that's a great source. This is a picture. There's Honest Abe Lincoln. You can tell by the stovepipe hat and the fact that he's way taller than everybody around him. So a photograph can tell us a lot about what happened. So the big thing about primary sources is they are firsthand. The person was there. Whoever made the source is not making it up. I mean, they witnessed it. Now, they might have a very different experience than other people who were there. So oftentimes you need to make a lot of primary sources to really know what happened. But when we were watching the news coverage of 9/11, that was a primary source because it was happening. And also they were interviewing people who saw it happen. And they were also giving an interview, which is a primary source. Primary sources can be words, images, objects, like artifacts. If you find a Native American arrow in your backyard, that's an artifact. That's a primary source. It can tell you about those people. They do not include any type of analysis. It doesn't tell you what we've learned. It doesn't tell you from this we know this. It doesn't tell you, oftentimes Christopher Columbus would use this, and it doesn't tell you any of that stuff. It's just like a snapshot of what happened. I mean, in the case of a picture, a literal snapshot. But in the case of the interview on 9/11, you just get to see what it actually looked like. Okay, the journal might describe a brief moment in history and what happened, but it doesn't give you a wide view. It gives you a very narrow and specific view of one person's experience at a historic event. So lots and lots of examples. Physical materials like artifacts, my attendance records here at school can be historical primary source. If everybody's ever trying to figure out like how many kids went to school, how many kids were in a world history class in the year 2020, okay, we would have a primary source from a teacher who was there. That's me. Pottery, actual battle sites. You can find stuff in the ground there. Weapons, that's an obvious one. What kind of technology do they have at the battle? Even how they build the roads and how they build the buildings tell us a lot about people, such as what building materials they had available, what was important to them, how advanced were they, did they have privacy in their houses? Because we see extra walls, which means they believed in privacy, or we see no walls, which means they didn't believe in privacy. There's lots of things you can learn from this stuff. Stuff we've studied in class, maps, charts, place names, can tell you a lot about people. And the stuff we're kind of most familiar with are visual records, such as drawings, paintings, photographs, and then written records. That's the big one. And that's where letters, diaries, my attendance record, your grades are written records, trial transcripts, actual books written by people who were there, autobiographies. Those are all written versions of primary sources, and these are all done by somebody that was at the event. So we'll skip that. Secondary sources. Secondary sources combine primary sources to make a more knowledgeable, but often, frankly, less interesting account. So they're secondhand information. Secondary sources are made by people who are not there. If I did a bunch of research, and I did this in college, if I went and read a bunch of notes and journals from people who were at the Battle of Bunker Hill, then I could go write a new paper that says, this is what the soldiers felt like Bunker Hill was like. And I'd combine all those and I'd get kind of a feel for what happened. The historychannel.com webpage that we looked at had a lot more information. It was combining all of the primary sources that they could get a hold of. So the person that wrote that article was not there. They went and found information and pictures and videos from people who were there. Okay, they include analysis and presentation. They tell you, here's what we learned. They tell you, from this, we know this. They tell you, this is what this means is. Okay, a person who's at the event, if you remember the video of 9/11, they had no idea what was going on. They were clueless. They're like, they didn't know the word terrorism at the time. Okay, later on, we figured out the terrorism thing because we analyzed all of the events. Okay, we figured everything out and we came to conclusions. So secondary sources come to conclusions. So classic examples of secondary sources is a written analysis where somebody, like I did with the Battle of Bunker Hill, I learn a whole lot about it and I say, okay, it must have been terrifying and here's how I know. Or the Americans were using outdated technology compared to the British because I learned these things. Okay, so it's usually far more informational and less emotional. Okay, a book that describes many years of an event, a lot of nonfiction that you find in the library is going to be secondary sources. Okay, we'll skip that. Bears beats Battlestar. Anyway, so when we're looking at a source, how do we know a source is good? Because obviously, if we're going to write an account or we're going to create a secondary source out of primary sources, we have to be able to trust that they're correct. Okay, anybody can write anything on the internet nowadays, and man, do a lot of people write some terrible stuff on the internet nowadays that is not factual at all. So we go through like a little checklist. First off, is it fact or is it opinion? Okay, and we'll do some work with that a little bit later in class. But is it a person's idea of what happened, or is it what actually happened? And you can look for words like I believe or stuff like that in there. Once it's been established as a fact, we look for internal consistencies or contradictions. And what this means is this person wrote an enormous, 5-page diary. Okay, is there stuff inside there that doesn't jive with other stuff? Then we check for external consistencies. Don't worry, we're going to talk more about this in a second. Does what they wrote not agree with what other people wrote? Okay, so let's say, I got an attendance record that says, Camden Nuremberg was out for quarantine for these 17 days. And then there's another teacher that says Camden Nuremberg was in class for these 14 days. We got to figure out what's going on here because we don't really know if either one of these is correct. Okay, so fact versus opinion, really straightforward. A fact is something that's true, it's tested, it's proven. One of the great problems we have in the world today is people take opinion as fact, okay? Or people try to pass off their opinion as fact. So an example, a fact is this pen is red. It is indeed a red pen. It's provable. Anybody who looks at this red pen can see that it's red. Okay? An opinion is this is a great pen. It actually is a great pen. According to me, somebody else might use this pen and say it's terrible. Okay? There's no way to prove whether it's great or not. That's a matter of a person's judgment. So facts can be proven. An opinion is what somebody thinks about an event. So when we talk about 9/11, a fact of 9/11 was a plane flew into the towers. An opinion would be this is the worst thing that's happened in America in the last 20 years. That's debatable. Okay? Or an opinion might be that when the towers fell, that's going to be a tragedy that's remembered by everybody for hundreds of years. That's an opinion. Okay? So you see clues when it's an opinion, things like I believe, I think. The word I doesn't appear in a whole lot of facts. Okay? People are referring to their internal process. Okay? Internal consistencies is within a single document. So I didn't do it. I never threw it. You can't prove that I threw it. Besides, I missed, didn't I? Well, if he missed, he had to have thrown it. Okay? So internal consistencies are a contradiction is when you have two facts within a document that cannot both be true. Okay? Jim flew to Antarctica on the 20th of January. Jim was home on the 20th of January. They can't both be true. Okay? So if there's something that doesn't jive within a document, it's an internal contradiction. So diary states that John went to school on Monday. Later it states that John never went to school on Monday. Those can't both be true. So all of a sudden, our source is a little suspect. Can't really trust it. Okay? Internal inconsistency, not as bad as contradiction, but it's a little fishy. Okay? So the facts are presented differently, or somebody feels two different ways about the same event. We start to see and start to question, is this really possible? Okay, so a diary states that John went to school on Monday. Later it mentions that John and Mary went to school on Monday. Why didn't it mention Mary the first time? That's weird. Let me start checking a little closer. If you see a contradiction, you have to consider throwing the document out. If you see an inconsistency, you have to check a little deeper and make sure that there's not some definite problems. Okay? External consistencies, same thing except it's when you're comparing this item to another document. Okay? So external contradictions is you find two sources, they say different things, and they cannot both be true. Okay? This is why we often check several sources before we write an account. Okay? A diary entry says John went to school on Monday. School attendance records say John was absent on Monday. Okay? Those are two different documents, two different sources. They cannot both be true. Now what do? Well, you investigate each one individually and find out which one has to be wrong. You don't have to throw them both out. Okay? But you do have to check in and say, well, the diary must be wrong because I found 3 other sources that say John was absent. Okay, so you start checking other things. Inconsistency is not as bad, but it still makes something suspect. Factual details are presented differently, which may raise questions about each source's accuracy. In other words, a diary entry states that John went to school on Monday. An interview with another student indicates John and Mary went to school on Monday. Why doesn't the diary entry mention Mary? Okay, especially if Mary is important to the story, should have mentioned her. Okay, so we take our sources, we put them through a process to see if we can trust them. And this is really important with the amount of malarkey that is on the internet, with the amount of things people lie about, with the amount of stuff people try to get away with. We need to look for inconsistencies. We need to look for contradictions. Okay, if we can't find any, then it's probably a trustworthy source. Okay, and if it's a fact, then we start using it. We find enough accounts, enough sources that pass our test, and we can start putting together an account of what happened. We start learning what really happened. And this is exactly what the History Channel did when they came up with their secondary source on 9/11. Okay, now we're going to practice doing all this in class. So the reason you need to know all this is because you're going to pick an event and you're going to write an account on it, and you're going to do it by finding sources and putting them through the process. Is this a trustable source or is it not a trustable source? As always, let me know if you have any questions, and have a great day.